Something strange is happening inside the WNBA right now, and almost nobody is talking about it honestly. The league is currently facing one of the most important moments in its entire history. Behind closed doors, negotiations are taking place that could decide the future of the sport for years to come. Owners and players are trying to finalize a brand new collective bargaining agreement. The deal that determines how much players get paid, how revenue is shared, and what the league will look like moving forward. And if those negotiations fall apart, there's a very real possibility the entire season could be thrown into chaos. But instead of focusing on the complicated negotiations happening between the league and the players' union, something else has taken over the conversation. Somehow, the blame is starting to land on one player, Caitlin Clark. Yes, the same Caitlin Clark who arrived in the league and immediately changed everything. The same rookie who shattered attendance records, boosted television ratings, and brought millions of new fans to women's basketball almost overnight. And yet now, somehow, people are asking a very different question. Why hasn't she fixed the problem? Why hasn't Caitlin Clark stepped in and used her platform to push the players and the league toward a deal? Why hasn't she spoken louder? Why hasn't she taken control of the situation? But the more you actually look at what's happening behind the scenes, the more confusing that question becomes. Because Caitlin Clark isn't part of the union leadership. She isn't negotiating the deal. And she certainly didn't create the tensions that are now threatening the future of the league. In fact, if anything, the situation reveals something much bigger than one player. Because right now, the WNBA isn't just dealing with a simple contract negotiation. The league is dealing with growing pains, power struggles, and a battle over what the future of women's basketball is supposed to look like. And as emotions rise, frustrations build, and negotiations drag on, the spotlight is getting brighter and brighter. Which means every comment, every decision, and every moment of silence suddenly becomes a headline. But the real story behind this situation is far more complicated than people realize. Because the truth is, the conflict inside the WNBA right now isn't just between players and owners. There are tensions inside the players' union. There are disagreements about strategy. There are questions about leadership. And there are even concerns about whether certain people involved in negotiations might have competing interests outside the league. All of that drama has created the perfect storm. And somehow, in the middle of it all, the league's newest superstar has become the easiest target. But to understand why Caitlin Clark is suddenly being pulled into this controversy, you first have to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes with the WNBA's collective bargaining agreement. Because this negotiation isn't just about salaries. It's about control. It's about the direction of the league. And it might end up being the most important moment women's basketball has faced in decades. But what's happening behind the scenes may shock a lot of fans. For most casual fans, the phrase collective bargaining agreement probably doesn't sound very exciting. It sounds like something that belongs in a boardroom, not on a basketball court. But in reality, the CBA is one of the most powerful documents in all of professional sports. It determines how money flows through the league, how much players can earn, how teams operate, and how the business side of the sport functions. Every major league, the NBA, NFL, MLB, operates under these agreements. And when negotiations over a new CBA become tense, the entire sport can be affected. Sometimes games get canceled. Sometimes seasons are delayed. And sometimes the entire league can come to a complete stop. Right now, the WNBA is trying to avoid exactly that situation. The current collective bargaining agreement between the league and the WNBA Players Association is reaching a critical point. Players want a new deal that reflects what they believe is a new era for women's basketball, an era where the league is growing faster than ever before. Over the past few years, the WNBA has experienced something it had been searching for decades: momentum. Attendance numbers have been climbing. Television ratings have started reaching new highs. Merchandise sales have exploded. And the overall visibility of the league has reached levels that many longtime observers never thought possible. Players believe that growth should translate into better pay and a bigger share of the league's revenue. And from their perspective, the argument makes sense. For years, WNBA players have pointed out that their salaries are dramatically lower than what athletes in many other professional leagues earn. Even some of the biggest stars in the sport have historically made salaries that barely reach six figures, while players in men's leagues often earn millions. Because of that gap, Many WNBA players have spent years playing overseas during the off-season just to increase their income. But now, with the league growing and attracting new investment, players believe the moment has finally arrived to push for a deal that reflects the sport's rising popularity. Reports suggest the players' union has proposed significant changes to the financial structure of the league. One of the biggest demands involves revenue sharing. Currently, WNBA players receive only a small percentage of overall league revenue compared to athletes in some other major sports leagues. The union has pushed for a system that would give players a much larger share, potentially somewhere around 25 to 30%. Along with that, players have also pushed for major increases in the salary cap. The proposed numbers would allow teams to spend dramatically more on player contracts, creating the possibility of larger salaries for both stars and role players across the league. From the players' perspective, the timing feels right. The sport is growing. New fans are watching. Corporate sponsorships are increasing. And the league is preparing to expand with additional teams in the future. But on the other side of the negotiation table, league owners see things a little differently. While they acknowledge the growth happening in women's basketball, many owners believe the financial situation of the league is still fragile. They argue that while the WNBA is improving, it hasn't yet reached the level of profitability that would support the kind of dramatic salary increases being proposed. Owners worry that agreeing to extremely aggressive financial demands too quickly could put long-term stability at risk. So instead of matching the union's proposals, the league has reportedly offered a more gradual approach. Under the league's counteroffers, salaries and revenue sharing would still increase, but at a slower pace. The salary cap would rise, but not to the levels the union is requesting. Revenue sharing would improve, but not to the percentage players are demanding. From the outside, this might look like a normal negotiation. But behind the scenes, the gap between the two sides has created serious tension. And the longer negotiations drag on without a deal, the more uncertainty begins to spread across the league. Players have begun discussing the possibility of drastic measures if negotiations stall. Some have suggested that if a fair agreement isn't reached, the players could consider refusing to play. Others believe the league and the union will eventually find a compromise before things reach that point. But even the possibility of a disrupted season has created anxiety throughout the basketball world. Because right now, the WNBA is experiencing something it has never had before. A massive surge of public attention. And that surge didn't happen by accident. It happened during one very specific moment in time. A moment that many fans now refer to as the Caitlin Clark effect. Which raises a complicated question. If the league is growing faster than ever before, and if one player helped bring millions of new eyes to the sport, should that player now be expected to help fix the league's biggest crisis? That question has sparked one of the most intense debates in the WNBA right now. And the answer might not be what people expect. Because when you start looking closer at the situation Caitlin Clark is actually in, you realize she might be the last person who should be carrying that responsibility. But the pressure surrounding her is only getting stronger. And the story behind why that pressure exists might surprise a lot of fans. Before Caitlin Clark ever stepped onto a WNBA court, women's basketball was already growing. But when she arrived, something completely different happened. The level of attention surrounding the sport exploded almost overnight. College basketball fans already knew how electrifying she was. During her time at Iowa, Clark had built a reputation as one of the most exciting players the game had ever seen. Her deep three-pointers, her fearless style of play, and her ability to take over games made her must-watch television long before she entered the professional ranks. But what happened after she joined the WNBA surprised even the league itself. Suddenly, arenas started filling up in cities that had struggled with attendance for years. Tickets for games involving Clark began selling out weeks in advance. In some places, teams moved games to larger venues just to handle the demand. Television ratings followed the same pattern. Games featuring Clark consistently drew some of the highest viewership numbers the league had seen in decades. Networks that previously struggled to generate interest in regular season games suddenly found themselves broadcasting matchups that fans were actively seeking out. And it wasn't just about the numbers. The entire conversation around the league started changing. Sports talk shows that rarely discussed the WNBA suddenly began debating its biggest storylines. Social media exploded with highlights, debates, and reactions. Even casual sports fans who had never followed women's basketball before began tuning in to see what all the excitement was about. For the first time in a long time, the WNBA felt like it had a true cultural moment, and Caitlin Clark was at the center of it. But moments like that don't just create excitement. They also create pressure. Because when one player suddenly becomes the biggest attraction in the sport, expectations start to grow in ways that can be difficult for anyone to manage. Every move gets analyzed. Every comment gets debated. Every game becomes part of a much larger conversation. And for Clark, that spotlight was intense from the very beginning. Some fans celebrated the attention she was bringing to the league. They believed Clark's popularity was exactly what women's basketball needed. A superstar capable of drawing millions of new viewers and accelerating the growth of the sport. But others worried about something different. They worried that the focus on one player might overshadow the many other talented athletes who had spent years building the league. The WNBA has always been proud of its depth of talent and its history of legendary players. Stars who dominated the sport long before Clark ever arrived had spent decades pushing the league forward. So when the conversation suddenly started revolving around one new name, the dynamic inside the league began to shift. Some players welcomed the increased attention. Others seemed frustrated by how quickly the spotlight had changed. And in a league where emotions already run high, that shift created a complicated atmosphere. But the biggest challenge wasn't the attention itself. It was the expectations that came with it. Because when fans begin to believe that one player is responsible for bringing the sport to a new level, they also start believing that player has the power to influence everything else. Suddenly, Caitlin Clark wasn't just being talked about as a basketball star. She was being described as the face of the league, the player whose presence could boost ratings, the player who could bring sponsors, the player who could attract new fans. And when someone gets labeled as the face of the league, people begin assuming they should also play a role in shaping the league's future. Which brings us back to the current situation. Because right now, the WNBA isn't just dealing with a surge in popularity. It's dealing with one of the most complicated negotiations in its history. And some voices have begun asking whether the league's biggest star should step in and help move things forward. But that idea raises an important question. Just because someone is the most visible player in the league, does that mean they're responsible for solving its biggest problems? Or is that expectation completely unrealistic? Because when you look at Caitlin Clark's actual position inside the WNBA, the answer becomes much more complicated than people might think. And the reality of her situation may surprise a lot of fans. In professional sports, superstars often carry influence that goes far beyond the court. When a player reaches a certain level of fame, their voice can become incredibly powerful. Fans listen. Media outlets amplify their comments. And sometimes, even league officials pay attention. Throughout sports history, there have been many moments where star athletes stepped forward during important negotiations or league disputes. Some have used their platforms to advocate for players' rights. Others have encouraged compromise during tense situations. So when the WNBA's collective bargaining negotiations started dominating headlines, it didn't take long for some analysts to begin asking a simple question. Where is Caitlin Clark in all of this? The logic behind that question is fairly straightforward. Clark currently has one of the largest platforms in women's basketball. When she speaks publicly, her comments travel quickly across social media, television, and sports news outlets. Her voice reaches millions of fans. Because of that reach, some people believe Clark could potentially influence how the situation unfolds. If she publicly pushed for players to reach a deal with the league, maybe it would encourage compromise. If she spoke strongly in favor of the union's demands, maybe it would increase pressure on the league's owners. Either way, the argument goes, her voice carries weight. But there's one major problem with that idea. Caitlin Clark isn't actually involved in the negotiations. She isn't a member of the players' union's leadership committee. She isn't sitting in the rooms where the details of the deal are being discussed. And most importantly, she's still incredibly early in her professional career. Clark is only in the second year of her WNBA journey. In sports terms, that makes her one of the younger voices in the league. Most professional athletes understand that union negotiations are typically led by veteran players, athletes who have spent years building relationships within the league and gaining the trust of their peers. Those players take on leadership roles because they've been through multiple seasons, multiple negotiations, and multiple changes within the league. They understand the history. They understand the stakes. And they often feel a responsibility to represent their teammates during those discussions. Clark, by comparison, is still adjusting to the professional game. She's learning the rhythm of the league, navigating the spotlight that comes with her popularity, and focusing on developing her career as a player. That doesn't mean she doesn't care about the outcome of the negotiations. In fact, Clark has already made it clear that she understands how important the current moment is for the sport. In one of the few times she addressed the situation publicly, she emphasized something that many fans immediately noticed. She said the league needs to keep playing. Her point was simple but powerful. The momentum surrounding women's basketball right now is incredibly valuable. The attention the league is receiving from fans, media, and sponsors has created an opportunity that doesn't come around very often. And if the season were disrupted by prolonged negotiations or a strike, that momentum could disappear quickly. But Clark was also careful with her words. Instead of taking sides, she spoke about the importance of continuing to grow the sport. She didn't criticize the players' union. She didn't criticize the league. She simply acknowledged that the moment was important and that the focus should remain on basketball. That careful approach didn't satisfy everyone. Some critics argued that Clark should be more vocal. Others believed she was doing exactly what a young player in her position should do, staying respectful of the league's leadership structure and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Because the truth is, speaking too loudly in a situation like this can create serious problems. If Clark openly pushed for players to compromise with the league, some of her fellow athletes might see that as undermining the union. If she aggressively supported the union's demands, owners and league executives might view her comments as confrontational. And if she accidentally said something that was interpreted the wrong way, it could trigger controversy that distracts from the negotiations themselves. In other words, every possible path carries risks, which may explain why Clark has chosen a more cautious approach. She understands that her words carry enormous weight, and sometimes the smartest move for a player in that position is to choose those words very carefully. But even that careful strategy hasn't stopped the pressure from growing. Because as the negotiations continue, and as tensions rise across the league, more and more people are looking for someone to blame. And when a league is experiencing uncertainty, the spotlight almost always falls on the biggest name in the room. But what many fans may not realize is that the real drama surrounding these negotiations might not involve Caitlin Clark at all. In fact, some of the most intense conflict in the WNBA right now may be happening inside the players' union itself. And if that's true, the situation might be far more complicated than anyone expected. While fans online argued about whether Caitlin Clark should be doing more, something else was quietly happening behind the scenes. The real tension inside the WNBA wasn't just between players and league owners. It was also beginning to surface inside the players' union itself. The WNBA Players Association, often called the WNBPA, exists to represent the athletes during negotiations with the league. Its leadership team is responsible for communicating with players, presenting proposals to owners, and guiding the entire negotiation strategy. Normally, those discussions happen privately. Players trust their union leadership to represent them fairly, and disagreements are usually handled behind closed doors. But during this round of negotiations, reports began to emerge suggesting that not everyone inside the union was completely satisfied with how things were being handled. Some players reportedly felt they weren't receiving enough information about the negotiation process. Others believed communication between union leadership and the broader group of players could have been more transparent. In professional sports, that kind of tension isn't unusual during CBA negotiations. These agreements involve massive financial decisions that can affect players' careers for years to come. It's natural for athletes to ask questions about the details of the deal being negotiated on their behalf. But as the WNBA negotiations continued, the questions seemed to grow louder. Agents representing players also began asking for more clarity regarding the direction of the negotiations. Agents, after all, have a direct interest in understanding how the financial structure of the league might change. Their clients depend on those agreements to determine future contract opportunities. So when communication becomes limited, agents often push for more information. And that pressure can add another layer of complexity to already delicate negotiations. Some players also began expressing concern about whether the current strategy would ultimately produce the best outcome. Not every athlete in the league has the same priorities. Veteran players who have spent years building their careers in the WNBA might prioritize long-term stability and sustainable growth. Younger players entering the league during this new era of popularity might see an opportunity to push for dramatic changes immediately. And players who have built business ventures outside the WNBA might view the situation from yet another perspective entirely. When all those viewpoints collide, union leadership has the difficult job of balancing competing interests while still presenting a unified front during negotiations. That's not an easy task. And the more pressure builds during negotiations, the harder it becomes to keep everyone aligned. But the internal tension inside the players' union wasn't the only thing raising eyebrows around the league. Because at the same time these negotiations were unfolding, another storyline was beginning to attract attention. A storyline involving a brand new basketball league. And that development would introduce a question that many fans and analysts suddenly started asking. Could there be a conflict of interest inside the leadership of the WNBA Players Union? At first, that idea sounded dramatic. But once people began looking closer at the situation, the conversation quickly became much more serious. Because some of the most influential figures involved in the union negotiations also happened to be connected to a completely separate basketball league. And that connection would soon become one of the most controversial topics in the entire debate. While the WNBA and the Players' Union were locked in negotiations over the future of the league, another development was quietly taking place in the background. A brand new basketball league had been created. The league was called Unrivaled. The concept behind it was ambitious. It would provide professional women's basketball players with another opportunity to compete during the off-season while earning additional income. The league promised a different style of play, a new platform for athletes, and financial opportunities that could supplement what players earned during the WNBA season. For many players, the idea sounded exciting. For years, WNBA athletes had traveled overseas during the off-season to play in international leagues and earn extra money. A domestic off-season league could allow players to stay closer to home while still competing and building their careers. But what made the Unrivaled League particularly interesting was who helped create it. Two of the most prominent figures connected to the project were also among the most recognizable stars in the WNBA. And not only were they star players, they also held important leadership roles within the WNBA Players Association. That's where the conversation started getting complicated. On the surface, the existence of an off-season league doesn't necessarily create a problem. Professional athletes across many sports participate in various leagues, tournaments, and events outside their primary competition. But when individuals involved in union leadership are also connected to another basketball league, some observers begin asking difficult questions. Questions about incentives, questions about priorities, and questions about whether those different roles could influence decision-making during negotiations. Critics began wondering whether the success of a separate league could potentially benefit if the WNBA experienced disruptions or delays. If the WNBA season were shortened or delayed due to negotiations, a competing league might receive more attention from fans and media. Even the appearance of that possibility was enough to spark debate. Supporters of the Unrivaled League quickly pushed back against those concerns. They argued that the league was created specifically to support players and give them additional opportunities to earn income. From their perspective, creating new platforms for women's basketball should be viewed as a positive development for the entire sport. They also pointed out that the WNBA has historically allowed players to compete in other leagues during the off-season. Many athletes have spent years playing internationally without that creating conflict with their WNBA careers. So from that standpoint, the idea that an off-season league automatically creates a conflict of interest might be an oversimplification. But perception can be powerful. And in the middle of intense negotiations, even the perception of competing interests can fuel controversy. Fans began debating the situation across social media. Sports commentators started raising questions during interviews and panel discussions. Some analysts suggested the issue was being exaggerated. Others believed it deserved serious scrutiny. And as the conversation grew louder, the pressure surrounding the entire negotiation process increased. But what made the situation even more fascinating was how it intersected with the ongoing discussion about Caitlin Clark. Because while all of this internal drama was unfolding, negotiations, union tension, questions about leadership, and debates about competing leagues, the spotlight kept returning to the same player, the newest superstar in the WNBA. The player who wasn't sitting in negotiation meetings. The player who wasn't running the union. The player who wasn't involved in building another basketball league. Yet somehow, the player who kept being blamed for the situation. Which raises an obvious question. How did Caitlin Clark become the center of a controversy that she didn't create? And more importantly, why does the pressure on her seem to grow every time the negotiations become more complicated? Because the truth is, Clark may now be caught in a position that almost no athlete would want to be in. A position where every move she makes could be interpreted as taking sides. And the next part of this story explains exactly why that situation might be impossible to escape. By this point, the situation surrounding Caitlin Clark had reached a strange place. The league was in the middle of intense negotiations. Players were debating the future of their salaries. Union leadership was facing questions about communication and strategy. A brand new basketball league had entered the conversation. And yet, despite all of those complicated factors, the spotlight kept finding its way back to the same player, Caitlin Clark. The irony of the situation is that Clark may actually be one of the least powerful people involved in the entire negotiation. She isn't a union executive. She isn't a team owner. She isn't a league official. She isn't sitting inside the rooms where the real decisions are being made. But she is something else entirely. She's the most recognizable face in the sport. And in the modern world of sports media, visibility often gets confused with influence. When fans see someone dominating headlines, they naturally assume that person must have control over what's happening behind the scenes. But the reality is very different. Clark's actual role in the WNBA is the same as every other player on the court. She plays the game. She prepares for her team's season. She focuses on improving her performance and helping her teammates win games. The business side of the league operates on a completely different level. And yet, because Clark's popularity is so massive, every moment of silence suddenly becomes its own story. When she doesn't comment on negotiations, people ask why she's staying quiet. When she gives a careful answer during an interview, analysts debate what her words really mean. And when she avoids the topic entirely, some critics interpret that as a lack of leadership. It's a situation where every possible choice carries consequences. If Clark speaks loudly in support of the players' union, some people might argue she's creating pressure on the league. If she supports the league's position, others might accuse her of turning against fellow players. If she stays neutral, critics say she isn't doing enough. And if she tries to stay completely silent, the speculation only grows louder. In other words, there may not be a perfect move available. For a player in her second year in the league, navigating that kind of attention would be difficult for anyone. Because while fans often see professional athletes as powerful figures, the truth is that many young players are still learning how the professional sports world works. They're adjusting to media scrutiny. They're learning how negotiations impact their careers. They're discovering how quickly public narratives can form around them. And Caitlin Clark has had to navigate all of that while being the most talked about player in the entire league. The pressure surrounding her isn't just about basketball anymore. It's about what she represents. To some fans, she represents the explosive growth of women's basketball. To others, she represents the future direction of the league. And to critics, she sometimes represents a symbol of the media attention surrounding the sport. Those different perspectives create a complicated environment where every action can be interpreted in multiple ways. Which is why Clark's approach so far has been extremely careful. She has acknowledged the importance of the current moment for the league. She has emphasized the importance of continuing to play games and building on the momentum the sport is experiencing. But she has avoided positioning herself as the person responsible for solving the conflict. And when you consider the circumstances, that decision might make more sense than people realize. Because the truth is, the future of the WNBA doesn't depend on one player. It depends on the decisions being made by dozens of people across the league. Players, union leaders, team owners, league executives. All of them have a role to play in determining how this situation unfolds. But as the negotiations continue, the pressure on Caitlin Clark continues to grow. And that pressure reveals something fascinating about the moment the WNBA is currently experiencing. The league has entered a new era of attention. But attention always brings new challenges. What's happening inside the WNBA right now isn't just about one negotiation. It's about a league that is suddenly growing faster than anyone predicted. For years, the WNBA worked steadily to build its audience. Players promoted the sport. Teams invested in their communities. Fans supported the league through seasons when attention from the broader sports world was limited. That slow, steady progress laid the foundation for the moment the league is experiencing today. But rapid growth can create unexpected challenges. When a sport suddenly gains new popularity, questions about money, leadership, and long-term direction become much more urgent. Players want to ensure they benefit from the growth they helped create. Owners want to protect the financial stability of the league as it expands. And fans want to see the sport continue moving forward without interruptions. Those goals are often aligned, but the path toward achieving them isn't always simple. The current CBA negotiations are essentially a debate about how to manage success. How much of the new revenue should go directly to players? How quickly should salaries increase? How can the league grow while maintaining financial stability? And who ultimately decides the direction of the sport? Those questions don't have easy answers. Even in much larger leagues with decades of history, CBA negotiations can become complicated and emotional. In the WNBA's case, the situation is even more complex because the league is experiencing a level of attention that is still relatively new. That attention has created excitement, but it has also created expectations. Fans now expect the league to continue growing rapidly. Sponsors expect the league to maintain its visibility. Media outlets expect compelling storylines. And players expect the financial structure of the sport to evolve alongside its popularity. Balancing all of those expectations at once is an enormous challenge. And it's one that the WNBA must navigate carefully, because moments like this can define the future of a sport. If the league successfully manages this transition, it could emerge stronger than ever. New teams could join the league. Player salaries could rise. Fan interest could continue growing. But if the situation becomes too chaotic, if negotiations collapse or momentum is lost, the progress the league has made could slow down dramatically. That's why so many people across the basketball world are watching these negotiations closely. They understand that the decisions being made right now could shape women's basketball for the next decade. And while Caitlin Clark may not be responsible for those decisions, her presence in the league has undeniably amplified the stakes. Because when a sport captures the attention of millions of new fans, every challenge suddenly feels bigger, and every decision suddenly carries more weight. At first glance, the narrative surrounding this situation seems simple. The league is negotiating a new deal. The negotiations are complicated, and people are looking for someone to blame. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the story becomes much more complex. The WNBA is entering a new era, an era of growth, an era of visibility, an era where the sport is reaching audiences that once seemed impossible. Moments like that are exciting, but they also bring pressure. Pressure on players, pressure on owners, pressure on the entire system that keeps the league running. And in moments of pressure, public conversations often focus on the most visible figure in the room. Right now, that figure happens to be Caitlin Clark. But the future of the WNBA will ultimately depend on something much larger than one player. It will depend on whether everyone involved in the league can find a path forward together. Players seeking fair opportunities, owners protecting the league's stability, and leaders on both sides recognizing the incredible moment the sport is experiencing. Because the truth is, women's basketball has never had more momentum than it does right now. Fans are watching. New audiences are discovering the game. And the opportunity to grow the sport has never been bigger, which makes the next chapter of this story incredibly important. The decisions made during these negotiations could determine whether the WNBA enters a golden era, or whether the momentum slows down just as the sport begins to reach new heights. And as the league moves forward, one thing is certain. The entire basketball world will be watching to see what happens next. If you want more deep breakdowns of the biggest stories happening inside the WNBA, the drama, the business battles, and the moments the headlines don't always explain, make sure you hit subscribe right now. Because the future of women's basketball is changing fast. And the next story might be even bigger than this one.